Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Today is Tuesday, December 21st, the 17th of Tevis. And we're studying the Talmud, the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time at the present, studying Mesechet Shabbat, Perek Asiri, chapter 10, Perek HaMatzniah. We are on 94a, Tzadik Daled Amud Aleph, and we're studying in prayerful wishes and in honor of the complete and speedy well-being and refuah, members of our Chabura and their family and friends, and in prayerful wishes for the list of names that we've been mentioning. I want to also mention that tonight our dear Mark will be observing yahrzeit for his mother-in-law, Charlotte Bas. Remind me again. Charlotte Bas Yitzchak. So the Neshama of Charlotte Bas Yitzchak Shavan Aliyah, and we wish good health and good circumstances for all of your members of our Gemara Chabura. Yesterday we inconclusively concluded the initial segment. It's not the only segment. A segment about carrying humans. Suffice it to say, here is the short summary. There is a general machlokes in our Gemara about carrying living creatures, a machlokes between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Nassan. I'm going to hit mute, but please unmute, of course, for all questions and comments. There's a machlokes between Rabbi Nassan and the Rabbanon about all living things. Rabbi Nassan seems to believe, I shouldn't say seems, he says that living creatures of all types carry themselves, noisas atma, and therefore it's not considered carrying to carry them. The Rabbanon disagree, and Rava says the disagreement is exclusively about livestock, about animals, but does not extend to human beings. By human beings, a person carries themselves. In the course of our Gemara, we discussed different reasons why we might distinguish or differentiate between a human being and other other creatures, whether it was Tosfos that had to do with the origin of the malacha of the Mishkan and the unique weakness of the malacha of carrying, or the way the Tosfos Harash taught us, which is that maybe there's an act of joint carrying. We also cover the fact that not all carrying is created equal. Rabbi Nassan would admit, he would concede that when a person is bound in a way that they are not able to be a partner in their being carried, or the Rambam informs us, and elsewhere in the Gemara discusses, a person that's sick, or perhaps a small baby who is not able to be a partner in their carrying, that would be considered carrying, whereas a regular human being is okay. The part of the Gemara, the part of the conversation that I'm actually going to skip right now, but we do need to get back to, is how we get from our Gemara, which tells us that carrying a human is acceptable, to the question that we've asked multiple times on our shir, which is, how do we get to the fact that Lamaisa today, nowadays, we would want and need an Eruv in order to carry? So that's, again, admittedly a facet of the conversation that we haven't directly yet considered over here. With Hashem's help, in due time, we will cover that, but I just wanted to acknowledge it and make sure we keep that on the short list of items that we will be, Ezer Hashem, be revisiting shortly. The reason why I want to show that is because today we're going to have an exciting and equally stimulating question. And it's an important question for the entirety of Masechet Shabbos. With Hashem's help, we'll do our best, and we'll work on this together. Again, we're at the tail end of a Mishnah that talks about 2 or 3 items. We talked about food and its relationship to a vessel. We talked about a living person and the relationship to the bed. We now come to the third, or maybe 2.2b, the second aspect of humans, and we're talking, of course, about the carrying of a mess, of a corpse on Shabbos. Can you carry a corpse on Shabbos, and can you carry the bed on Shabbos? And if you can, why can you? And it's going to boil down to a very important principle in the laws of Shabbos that we've referenced, but today we'll get a chance to explore it to some extent. And this is one of the instances another instance where Rashi and Tosfos and other commentaries vigorously discuss the parameters of the principle that's going to be introduced. So again, I know that's a lot of teasing, but let's take a look at the Gemara inside, and then we'll see it first hand. Here we go. The Mishnah comments, "Es hames b'mita chayiv, carry a corpse on a bed, one is chayiv, etc. Similarly, we're talking about the fact that a human remains cannot be carried on Shabbos because you're not allowed to carry human remains on Shabbos. It's muksa. Actually, I'm sorry, take that back. Not muksa. It's considered carrying. And then we have Rabbi Shimon who says poiter hay Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishnah adds Rabbi Shimon says that actually you may carry human remains, and the question is why, and that's going to be our discussion. Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Shimon Lakish. The sages of the Talmud, either Rabba Bar Chana quoting Rabbi Yechanan, or alternatively or additionally Rabbi Yosef quoting Rish Lakish, say like this: poiter hay Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon extended an exemption. He permitted to carry out human remains. Not only when you are simply transporting human remains to move it out of your house, even in the scenario where one is going to bury the dead. Here is the question. I'm going to say the line. We're going to read a little more Gemara, and then we'll get into the analysis. There's a principle that we've referenced a number of times. We even referenced it when we were studying the Mishnah. Actually, Rashi, I believe, pointed it out explicitly, which is as follows. Human remains, when you move them, are you hoping to do anything with those remains? Do those remains contribute substantively to your life, to your day, to your experience? And of course, the answer is everyone wishes they did not have to deal with human remains. It's the greatest tragedies when you have a corpse that needs burial, or a corpse that introduces impurity, but ultimately it's a terrible tragedy. And so a person is not needing to do something with the human remains. And so it's possible that a malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. I'm only translating it very loosely because I want to share with you the different interpretations. Malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. You don't actually want, desire, or do something constructive with this act. So Rav Shimon says you are potter. We haven't given much explanation. I just want to give you the words, let the words hang, and then we'll see Rashi and Tosfos and the commentaries as this Gemara unfolds. I just want to share with you the words of Rashi on the Mishnah. So we're actually going to bounce back just briefly.
Rabbi, is a kohen included in that?
Explain your question, please.
With a dead body. If there's a dead body in your house on a Shabbos, do we have to call somebody in, or can we do it ourselves? Are we exempt also?
No, hold on. There's many different. We're talking about the possibility of transporting human remains.
Right.
A kohen is prohibited to come into contact with human remains, with a rare small exception, which is a mes mitzvah, right?
Right.
Here, we're not talking at all about the status of a kohen or a Levi, or even about the mitzvah of burial. We're talking about on Shabbos, if one is allowed to handle and carry human remains. We're not even talking about the laws of muksa, which is another question. We're talking about, are you allowed to transport? Are you allowed to carry human remains? Or not even are you allowed? Is carrying human remains from one domain to another considered a malacha that does it have the criteria that would cause you to be biblically in trouble? That's the question. Does carrying human remains, hold on, does carrying human remains in a way that if you carry a cup of water or anything else, does it have the criteria that would cause one to be liable for carrying? That is the question. In our minds, our default assumption is, of course, why would you ever not be chayiv? Right? Why would you ever not be liable for carrying something you're not allowed to carry? And the good news is your assertion that, of course, you should be liable is the first opinion in our Mishnah, right? That you're not allowed to carry a corpse from one domain to another. That is the first position expressed in our Mishnah. So again, to back up for a moment, our Mishnah says to carry a living person, you're allowed to, you're not considered biblically carrying if you carry a human person, because there's something special about carrying a living human person. That's what the Gemara taught us. A corpse does not have that special thing that a living person contributes. Therefore, of course you are not allowed to carry a human person, the human remains. That's what makes sense to us, right? Rabbi Shimon has a interesting perspective. It says that actually, although maybe you shouldn't carry a corpse from one domain to another, it is not considered the biblical act of carrying on Shabbos. Those are the words of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon Pleiter. This is confusing because why would you not be?
But
Go ahead.
But Rabbi, you mentioned before that there's no benefit to this, okay, to carrying a corpse. But how does that how is that not influenced by the laws of burial, and therefore facilitating the need to prepare or bury on Shabbos?
So, Doctor, you're asking an important question. It's the question. It's such an important question. It's the question that informs the definition of the words that we're going to talk about. You're saying if you, God forbid, a person, God forbid, has a loved one that passes on after 120, you must bury them. You must care for their remains. You want to care for them. You want to treat their body, which in Jewish tradition is holy and important, with dignity. And we also want to provide for the sensitivity of the people around you and in the home that are traumatized or otherwise need to manage these human remains after 120. So therefore, how could we use the words "Eina tzricha legufa"? How could you say that you are not in need? And this question is critical. I know I'm kind of teasing you a little bit by not immediately giving the answer, but it's a little bit nuanced. So I would like to see it in the primary sources. So what I just did here is I opened up the original Rashi. I'm getting a lot of feedback from someone's mic. Alan, if you don't mind, I'm just going to hit mute because we're getting a lot of scratching.
Rabbi, you have Eila Dvorim Shein Lahem Shiur.
So again, the statement here is about the laws of Shabbos, not at all about the value of caring for human remains and bringing a person to dignified burial. There's a simple question, which is carrying human remains from point A to point B, from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or for Amos in the Rosh Hashanah, for any reason, not a biblical problem. The first opinion of the Mishnah of the Tanna Kama says, let me show you the words inside the Mishnah. Esames b'mitav, you carry human remains in a bed. Chayiv, you are liable. You carried. You're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. You carried. Why is it considered carrying? Because you're not allowed to carry human remains. Not only not an entire human remain, even a small part of human remains, God forbid, that too is considered, is not allowed to be carried. Rabbi Shimon Poiter, and then we saw those words in the Mishnah. We're discussing now in the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon says, actually, maybe you shouldn't do it, but it's not considered carrying on Shabbos. And those words are shocking, hard to chew on. I'm sorry, hard for us to wrap our heads around it. How could you be exempt? How could it be considered not carrying? Now we'll drop a word. A malacha has to be with intent, and you have to desire the result. But of course, if you're handling, if you're moving, you're transporting human remains, you desire the result. And so Rashi introduces to us the words that, according to Rabbi Shimon, have a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. This is a malacha that you do not need for its essential function, its essential purpose. Now I want to read Rashi's words to try to understand how Rashi defines this word. But someone wanted to say something?
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yeah.
So I think how we get here is one of the reasons you're allowed to carry the human being is he's helping, and the mace is not helping.
Oh, so you're saying it's not something special about a human mess. A human mess lost the unique waiver of a living person. And so it goes back to the default of everybody else, which is you're not allowed to carry them. You're not allowed to carry anything. There's a unique waiver about a living human, yes?
Yeah.
That's why you're not allowed to carry. That's why the Tanna Kama says you cannot carry human remains. But right now we're struggling, and we're about to look at Rashi to see the words he uses to understand why Rabbi Shimon says you are allowed to carry human remains. Or said differently, Poiter, you do not have biblical liability. You do not need to bring a chatos. And if one did so after Hasra, they would not get to stoning. How could that be? Why would Rabbi Shimon say that you're potter? And so Rabbi Shimon introduces an entirely different notion in our discussion, the question of sricha ligufa. And here's how Rashi explains it. And I think Dr. Hammer Rashi is going to explain your question. I hope he does. Afilu b'mes shalom, you're not allowed to carry even you would not be chayiv. You would not be considered biblically in desecration of Shabbos, even if you transport the entire human remains. This is a kind of melacha. This is a kind of Shabbos prohibited act. You do not wish or want this melacha. Why? When you move human remains, what are you doing? Ella lisalka mi olav. You simply need to move the remains from here, from your presence. Dr. Hammer, hold your question because that's what the Gemara addresses. So because you don't want to have human remains, we all wish that a person never passed on. We all wish that we didn't have to deal with this situation. Moving human remains is not because it's going to contribute something to your day, not because having it in point B is going to brighten your day or give you something that you needed. You're moving it because you need to remove human remains. And by the way, I know this is insensitive, but talk to someone that is in the Chevra Kadisha or in a funeral home. They always describe the act of taking human remains and preparing them for burial in what I think is a very callous and insensitive word. It's described as removal. You ever notice that?
Yeah.
It always bothers me. It's jarring.
Right.
It's jarring. Removal, honorary,
Right.
But that's the word they use. And maybe intentionally or unintentionally, it reflects this perspective of Rashi, which is that we wish that we did not have to do this act. This is not an exciting trip that we're happy to be taking with our loved ones. This is something that's only because we have no choice. It's being removed from us, it's being taken from us. And so Rashi says, the person did not want this circumstance to arrive, and in the absence of the passing of this individual, he would never want to have a human remains either in point A or point B. And therefore, to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, this is not the kind of desirous, intentionally wanted melacha. And so Rashi, shockingly, I still have a hard time really eating this definition. Whenever you see the words melacha, she'ena tzricha legufa, a melacha that's not needed, you don't need the act of the melacha. According to Rashi, you actually do want to do it. You need to do it. But you really wish that those circumstances had never arrived. And this becomes Rashi's definition of melacha, she'ena tzricha legufa. A kind of melacha you wish you'd never had to do. And it's a reactive malacha. You are compelled into the circumstance, but you're unhappy about the circumstances. And this is the case with our circumstance, the transportation of human remains. No one wishes that they had to ever transport human remains. I mean, maybe the Chevra Kadisha does because that's what keeps them in business. But the reality is that it's always an unfortunate circumstance. And in our Gemara, there's an added wrinkle, which is that you also don't wish to have something that conveys ritual impurity to remain randomly in a structure, and it needs to be brought immediately to Kavura.
Well,
Hold on one more second. Maybe some of you remember long ago in the Gemara in Meseches, I think it was B'mem Adlikin. We talked about putting out fire on a wick. And we explained a shocking fact that putting out fire on a wick just to stop the fire might not be considered a biblical malacha of kiboy, of putting out, of mechabe, of putting out fire. We used an interesting scenario. We said, if you want the ash or you are using it to prepare the wick. And so, because when something's on fire, according to Rabbi Shimon, not according to the Tanakama, not according to the Rabbanim, but according to Rabbi Shimon, the only time that a malacha is considered a malacha is if you proactively desire the circumstance and the result. And therefore, when it comes to a fire on a wick, Rabbi Shimon would give you an exemption unless he's doing it with a proactive desire to have the wick burn better later. And Rashi told us then the words Shimchas ala psila, if his concern is to save the psila, then it's a malacha she'ein tzricha l'gufa. He never wanted the wick to burn. He wants the wick to be present. And so this becomes, throughout the Masechta, as we'll see, Rashi's understanding. I struggle with it a little bit because it doesn't jive perfectly with the words malacha she'ein tzricha l'gufa. You don't need it, but that is Rashi's definition. And so a mess, according to Rabbi Shimon, you wish you never had it. You're not excited about transporting it. You wish you would be able to avoid this forever by not having a mess. But the situation arrives, and therefore Rabbi Shimon says you're patur. It doesn't mean you should. Patur doesn't mean do it. Patur means you're exempt from biblical consequences. All right. I'm sorry. A few people wanted to say something.
I just wanted to mention, I mean, aside from the halachic issue, just in the days of the Gemara, with no refrigeration, with the climate being what it was in Israel,
You absolutely wanted to.
you wanted to remove the body because it would become unpleasant.
Yeah.
So
And
there is a
there's
benefit to that. So there is a benefit.
The benefit is only, in other words, we say bidi avad. You're now in a mess, and here's how you have to respond to the undesirable situation. Maybe mess is the wrong word when talking about a corpse, because mess is the Hebrew word for a corpse. But you have a corpse, you have a mess present, you have to now reactively deal with it. But it's not something that anyone ever wanted to deal with, and that's the point. This point becomes more underscored when we see the line in the Gemara. Af lekivura. Even when you're actually bringing the mess to kivura. So this is Dr. Hammer's point. You're doing something that in a sense you do want to do. You want to honor loved ones with an honorable kivura, or in Yerushalayim and in general in Jewish principle is we want to bring a person to a fast as possible kivura. And so maybe there we'd be more inclined to say this is something that is shricha legufa. You do need to, if to give honorable burial, you do need to transport the person's the remains. But even that is considered ein shricha legufa according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Beryl?
Maybe it's my short-term memory loss, but this concept of she'ein tzricha lo, did we have it expressed this way before in any other melacha?
We had it, but we've never had the opportunity to really put a spotlight on it like this moment, because there's never been an instance that's so jarring and so relatable and so shocking, to be honest, as this conversation in the Gemara.
Because this is a wide concept. Who's to describe? This one is clear, but you know what tzricha to you is not tzricha to me.
But I think we can all agree that no person wants to have to bury. No one has.
Right. I'm not worried.
So that's our definition. According to Rabbi Shimon, this is not halacha l'maisa necessarily. This is not necessarily the prevailing opinion, but this is an opinion, which is so interesting that we're taking this time to let it seep in, and we're exploring Rashi's interpretation, and soon we'll see Tosfos, and we'll use this as a case study or an opportunity to generally appreciate how Rashi defines tzricha l'gufa and how Tosfos and others define tzricha l'gufa. So yeah, we have discussed it, like I said, when we talked about the wick and burning it. It's a discussion that we'll also talk about in other other circumstances, but this is certainly the one that gets the headlines. This is the one that gets at least my attention. Someone else wanted to say something?
I wanted to say something, but isn't there a law that says that if one person carries it part way and the other person carries it the other way, that they're off the hook?
So you're asking, are there heterim? Are there loopholes, legal loopholes, to allow for honorable burial of a possibly not, but possibly? But that's not our question. Our question here is, God forbid, a person has a corpse show up in their home, and they would like to move it out of their home and bring it to the funeral home, and there's no hearse. The hearse is not available, so you take your car and you do this honorable job of forget the car. You do the honorable job of transporting the human remains on Shabbos. Is that a biblical prohibition? Now you might say, I didn't know that it's a prohibition. I know how important it is to honor human remains, and that's why our discussion here is about a chatas. Our discussion here is about if you unwittingly or unknowingly did a malacha. So this is not about you're bad, you broke Shabbos. This is about, is this an acceptable practice on Shabbos? And the Mishnah says no. And Rabbi Shimon says, also possibly no, but it's not a biblical prohibition. You don't need to bring a chatas.
But in the law, in the law that says that you don't have, if one person takes it part way and the other one takes it the other way, it can bypass this law
Okay, but that's not
because
what we're talking
nothing is
about.
being specified.
But that's not what we're talking about. Right now, we're not talking about what to do with human remains. We're talking about what to do if you move to human remains. What is the Shabbos principle? Right?
Okay.
Again, to make things even more confusing, you have, I made this disclaimer when we read the Mishnah. But basically, there's two questions. There's muksa, and then there's haitzah. And right now, we're not talking about muksa. We're talking about carrying. And
Rabbi.
again, yes, doctor.
You're talking about honoring human remains.
Yes.
Is there any place that there's a discussion about psychological needs of, just like we bury as quickly as possible, and that there are various reasons, and notwithstanding Rabbi Nachum's reality of the body decomposing and the smell and all of that, but what about the human needs of the person, the remaining
the next of kin.
the remaining family members?
Yeah.
In other words, how important it is for their acceptance and psychological well-being to do this. So the question is, are there other areas of halacha where there's serious consideration of that as either
Certainly.
a heter or at least a reason why there's some flexibility in the law?
There is certainly discussion more in the context of muksa than carrying, about the ability to how one might be able to transport human remains from one room to another, either by having a non-muksa item placed on human remains. We've discussed this actually, or on certain holidays, perhaps hiring a Gentile. There is discussion. Right now, we're really talking about a de facto scenario where a person did something and they want to find out I'm portraying it this way because I think that's the most simple way. The de facto scenario where a person did something and now they're trying to find out is what they did a biblical Shabbos transgression of carrying, or perhaps a rabbinic issue, or none at all. Or in other words, we're trying to give the core definition of, is this a malach? Certainly there is vast discussions about what one should actually do in the circumstance. Here we're talking almost academically about a specific scenario, the transportation of human remains from one domain to another, or for Amos in the public domain. Well, can we close the door?
Yeah, it's not the door.
No, it is the door.
Could this be the same as a dead horse on your lawn on Shabbos?
I certainly would not compare in any way a dead horse to human remains.
No,
except
of
that
course not. But we're talking about dead things.
Yeah, but here's actually what I want to do. I want to do one more thing here, if you don't mind. It's that one also. All right, folks, give me 1 second. Just the rain is making a lot of noise, so I'm just going to close the door. It's going to rain out there? No, it's the noise.
Yeah.
You still teaching? It's not going to last long, probably.
No,
Oh, there it is. Are we finished?
that's how it goes. Yeah.
Hey, folks, we're getting a little rain down here. All right. All right, let's go to the Gemara. So this is the Mishnah again, and we studied. Actually, let me just do one more thing here. let's look for Tosfos, not Tosfos. No, Tosfos. All right. So again, our Mishnah discusses. It's introduced in an interesting way. We talk about human remains. I'm sorry, a living person. You're allowed to transport them because Chai Noisas Asma. That was the point. From there, we pivot to talk about, okay, what about a corpse on a bed? And of course, whatever the halacha is for the corpse is going to be the halacha for the bed. And so you're chayiv. And shockingly, Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah says you're a potter. How far does Rabbi Shimon's license to carry human remains extend? Or how far does Rabbi Shimon's viewpoint that this is not a biblical malacha extend? So for this, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Poiter Hayi Rabbi Shimon, even when you're bringing the mess to Kippur, when you move a mess, when you're removing human remains, maybe then you're not tzricha legufa. You don't want the remains in point B. The reason why you're moving remains from point A to point B is because you don't want them in point A. And that's a fact. Maybe, so again, I hope this is not triggering, but so God forbid a person passes away. So you remove them, the remains, to a funeral home. Why are human remains brought to the funeral home? Is it because the human remains contribute something to the funeral home? No, but you need to bring it to a place that's equipped to handle human remains. So for that step, Rabbi Shimon says, okay, that's not considered transporting. Now, again, I want to point out that it's possible that at the time of the Mishnah, they didn't have a funeral home, but suffice it to say, you needed to get the human remains away from the house and into a place that they could prepare for burial. But maybe when you say, and this is Dr. Hammer's question, maybe when you bring the human remains to Kivura, this is something that you are tzricha legufa. You need to, you want to do so, you need to do so. It's part of what our tradition is. It's halachically mandated. It's psychologically beneficial. So maybe you'll say this is considered tzricha legufa. And so there Rabbi Shimon says, no, even Kivura is considered eina tzricha legufa. Let's read Rashi. Don't say that the exemption, the non-biblical carrying, is only when you take it out of your house. There's nothing constructive to you from the fact that you're moving the body out of your house and into a public domain. Even when what you're doing is for the constructive benefit of the human remains, or the family who is responsible to care and bring their family to a dignified final burial, even that is considered eina tzricha legufa, which supports Rashi's understanding that what is eina tzricha legufa? You really wish you didn't need to be in this circumstance. That is Rashi's impression. You really wish it didn't happen. You really wish you didn't need a beer today. And unfortunately in life, sometimes, many times, we might find ourselves in circumstances we really wish we were not. So let's let that point sink in. Again, this is not everyone's opinion. This is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Shimon is the one who says, Malacha sheina tzricha legufa. If you don't need, Malacha isn't needed for, or essentially desire, it's not really what you want. Again, in Rashi's definition, you are potter. Amar Rava further adds to our conversation. Although usually Rabbi Shimon is keen on saying you are potter, if ein tzricha legufa, Rabbi Shimon will admit to one related scenario. Why did Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon will agree that if you use a tool, a hoe, to dig, and so you're carrying it, to bury, or a Sefer Torah to read it, you are chayiv for carrying. Rashi, because when a person carries out this tool, you're chayiv, and when you carry a Sefer Torah to read it, you're also chayiv because you desire the Torah. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Pshita, of course. You're not allowed to carry something that you want. If you're carrying a tool to use, you want it. If you're carrying a Torah to read from it, you want it. The ihanami malacha shenetzricha legufa. Ela malacha shenetzricha legufa. I'm sorry. The nami malacha she'ena tzricha legufa hi. If even a tool that you need is also considered a malacha she'ena tzricha legufa somehow, maybe because you don't use a Torah, you read it, then you're essentially ruling out any scenario that there's ever a malacha shetzricha legufa, because these are classic malachas that you desire and want to do. So the Gemara says, no, mahu detema ad deika. Mahu detema. He's coming to teach us a chiddush. Ad deika legufa legufa. Maybe malacha shetzricha legufa would mean the carrier and the malacha both need jointly this item. For example, a hoe that could be used to sharpen its blade, meaning to fix it and to dig it, or a Sefer Torah, maybe a Sefer Torah, you would need it for two functions, both to fix it and then to use it. Kamash Malan, therefore we are taught that even when all you're doing is using the item, not fixing the item, you're still chayiv. Again, to explain. Rava says Rabbi Shimon would agree that if you're taking out a Torah just to read it, or a hoe just to dig with it, to exclude a far off hypothetical where maybe Rabbi Shimon would say you're only chayiv when tzricha legufa, the act of carrying is to fix the thing that you're carrying and to use it, which is a far out scenario, but Rava wants to clarify that that's not the definition of malacha, shetzricha legufa, that the item that's being carried is being enhanced. No. So long as you're carrying an item and it contributes to your job or to your day, then you're considered chayiv. Let's read Rashi. Mara last like tas v'lachbar. Mara shenirtzaf piv, a dulled hoe. The tzarich lahoyshev alav kimin tas dak sheiroi lachbar, and it needs to be replaced. And either they would add on a sharp edge, or they would sharpen it, or like yell Christ. So basically, let's just again. You might carry an item you might take an item from point A to point B for two reasons: either to use it or to fix it. Rava wants to tell us that, according to Rabbi Shimon, you don't need both uses. Just putting it to use is sufficient to be considered a doing malacha. Let's let's pause over here. I want to share with you, although it's not in our Tosfos, but I want to share with you a overview of how Tosfos, based on other places in the Gemara, discusses the issue of melacha she'ein tzricha legufa. So bear with me a moment. All right, so this is again not in the text because this is based on later discussions. But here is an overview of another way to understand malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. So malacha she'ein tzricha legufa means the degree of use or the contribution of this melacha is not identical to the fullness of how the melacha was done in the Mishkan. Its use is less extensive or diminished than the way it was done in the Mishkan. So for example, when transporting human remains, although you do need to move them, but in the Mishkan, they would only transport stuff to use them. Whereas here, the transportation of human remains is not to use the human remains, but only for the purpose of dignified treatment of the remains. Similarly, there's an instance in trapping where you might trap a snake, for example, because it's deadly. So according to this paradigm, according to the question of malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, you don't trap a snake usually to use it unless you happen to have a laboratory that makes use of venom. That's another question. But usually you trap dangerous items to get them out of to cause them or to prevent them from doing danger. So here, this kind of trapping, according to Rabbi Shimon, according to this, would also be considered malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, because you're not going to be using the item that you're trapping. You're trapping it to get it out of circulation. Whereas in the Mishkan, trapping was to do something constructive with it. And so Tosfos has this interesting, and this is expressed in the Tosfos Harash and elsewhere, Tosfos has this interesting principle. Malacha she'eina tzricha legufa means that its use or its function is diminished from the primary use the way it was in the Mishkan. Similarly, there's a question about popping a blister. Mapis morsa. So the question is, why is one popping a blister? If one is exclusively popping the blister to remove pus, it might not be considered a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, whereas because in the Mishkan, the entrances that were created for bringing stuff in and out, whereas here it's pure extraction. So Tosfos again connects the definition of malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. This is more of a teaser than an exhaustive introduction, but Tosfos basically has a different definition. Rashi says, you wish you didn't have to do it. That's a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. Tosfos says no. It's when the use is considerably diminished from the primary way it was done in the Mishkan. Again, bringing us back to a theme that we're going to come to notice that's somewhat common, which is Tosfos has a greater emphasis and constant reference and correlation to the malachis the way they were in the Mishkan. And Rashi, not so much. Rashi looks more at the essential point, the essential item. Now we're going to see a story that's brought in the Gemara about the subject of human remains. Hahu shachva dehava b'droi keres, in the city of Drokera. Anyone know where that was? Anyone ever visited Drokera? All right, Google's not helping us. So there was a corpse. Shara Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Lafuki Lecharmelis. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak permitted moving the deceased individual from wherever it was, which was not a place that created dignity for the human remains, and he allowed it to be moved into a Carmelis. Rashi, either because the body was in an undignified manner, or possibly the human body was in jeopardy of being ruined damaged in a fire, or the human remains were sitting in the sun in a way that would expedite decomposition, which would also not be covered for the mess. And he allowed the body to be moved. And Rashi points out, we're not talking here about muksa, because if there's muksa, there's a scenario. There is a solution. But here we're talking about carrying. Amar li Rabbi Yochanan, the Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak gets a little pushback. Kiman, he said, whose opinion are you upholding when you allowed the carrying of the human remains? Ki Rabbi Shimon. Were you following the viewpoint of Rabbi Shimon? And Rabbi Shimon is the one who says that you're allowed to move human remains. Well, who says that Rabbi Shimon actually allows you to remove human remains? And this Gemara is going to make a point that I've been trying to make. Eimar, the pot of Rabbi Shimon, Michi of Chatas. It's possible that Rabbi Shimon was saying, if de facto, if a person already moved a corpse, then maybe they are going to be exempt from a chatos, from a biblical atonement. Isura de Rabbanan miyaika, it is still prohibited rabbinically. The Rabbanan don't allow it. Later, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Ha'elokim, by God. I don't know if we've ever seen this expression in our study of the Gemara yet. The Eilos Be'at, Afilu Rabbi Yehuda Shari. This is so permissible. It's not only a fringe or a single opinion that allows the transportation, the movement of these human remains. Afilu the Rabbi Yehuda Shari, even Rabbi Yehuda, who does not provide an exemption for malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, he would also permit moving of this corpse. Was my heter, was my license to move the human remains for Amis in what was perceived as a Rishus Harabim? Was I talking about a public domain? Lecharmelis coming. I'm talking about in a Carmelis, which, Mark, in a Carmelis, is there a biblical prohibition of carrying?
Only Rabbanan.
Only the Rabbanan. And Gadol, Kavod Habriya Shadoiches Lo Yisaseh Shabbatayra. Being that really Kavod Habriya is so essential that under certain circumstances it might even strongly influence or push away a Lo Yisaseh Torah. Certainly here I was allowed, and I feel confident with my psak that you're allowed to move the corpse within a Carmelis in a way that would bring dignity to the human remains. Rashi, Lo Yisaseh, Lav de Lo Yisaseh Kiach. Interesting. Which Lo Yisaseh is being pushed away here by him saying you're allowed to move the human remains in a way that would provide dignity. So Rashi says there is a Lo Yisaseh that says Lo Yisaseh. You're not allowed to deviate from a rabbinic prohibition as well. So the Chachamim say you're not allowed to carry in a Carmelis. Rav Nachman Yitzchak says the Torah itself. Yeah, the Torah itself says that you're allowed to, or we have a principle in Psak that says that for Kavod Habriyos, we're allowed to push away the Lo Yisaseh of Lo Yisaseh, meaning the Chachamim's takana could be waived in this scenario under these circumstances. The reality is that we have to remember, and Rashi's making this point, the Gemara is making this point, that we do not take a rabbinic enactment lightly. We take rabbinic enactments very seriously. Why? Because the Torah tells us you have to take the Chachamim's Piskei Dinim, you have to take what the Chachamim tell us seriously. Therefore, you have to follow it. But sometimes when the Chachamim made a Gezerah, they added a fine print. They added some fine print to the takana. And so there are various halachic considerations that are taken when dealing with a Rabbanan that were presented and created by the Rabbanan. So the Rabbanan made a Gezerah, but they also added in the fine print that sometimes, for example, if there's a suffix, we err on the side of leniency, or sometimes in a circumstance of Kavod Habriyos, one would be allowed to remove the human remains. Rashi gives us, interestingly here, a lot of reasons why you may have to move the human remains within a Carmelis. Possibly it was left in an undignified manner or in jeopardy. Just put on there as part of it. Actually, the human remains is going to be undignified. So Dr. Hammer, this doesn't entirely answer your question, but I think it's moving in that direction. That there is strong consideration for human dignity, being that this is all only prohibited. The Rabbanan themselves would allow under this situation to be carried. That is Rashi's explanation. Okay, the interesting thing over here is that for some reason, and it's I guess my mistake of relying too strongly on Sefaria, is that we have the Tosfos that I wanted to share with you that I couldn't find is just linked to the next citation. It's a little late now to get into Tosfos, so here's what I'm going to propose. I think we're going to end a few minutes early today, but tomorrow, Bli Neder, we'll start off our shir before going further with this very interesting discussion about when and if one would be allowed to transport human remains in a carmelis, we're going to go back to Tosfos and see it inside. Let's just take a fast look the way this is brought in halacha, and then we'll call it a day. Let's start with the Rambam. Again, trigger warning. There's references to human remains, and so this is the way the Rambam codifies argument. Babayis, v'nimsa misbaze bein achayim v'heim misbaze mimenu. Dr. Hammer, here the Rambam more explicitly explains your point. God forbid a person passes away and the human remains begin to decompose, again at a time where there was no refrigeration, there wasn't even air conditioning. And what the result is, shame to the living and to the dead, or primarily, shame for the living. So that Dr. Hammer, the Rambam here makes this point clear. And this causes, here the word we use is shame, but I think we could probably inject some of the other emotional hazards that are associated with this painful situation. It is permitted to move the human remains to a carmelis, not to a rishus harabim, in a way that would mitigate some of the emotional troubles that the people, the living, are subject to. And the Rambam says, Gadol kavod habriyos, human dignity is so essential that it even pushes away the loisase, the Torah commandment, which we are instructed not to deviate from the words of the Chachamim. However, the Rambam and the Gemara is going to add a considerable restriction. If the people have where to go, better for the individuals to find a temporary place to hang out. But if the individuals, the family, have a place to go, it is preferred for them to find an alternate space where they can hang out that would not subject them to all of this anguish. But again, this is codified in Jewish law, that when we're not pushing aside a biblical prohibition, we're not saying that you can go into Times Square or another rishus harabim, but if it's only a carmelis, well, then there is a scenario, although it's preferred for the humans to move aside. In the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, similarly, using the Rambam's words, Rashi, the Ramah says, from these words, it would seem like maybe there needs to already be decomposition. There already needs to be an unpleasant situation. The Ramah says, even if it has not yet started to be unpleasant in the most painful way of decomposition, but you know that it's going to occur. So then mutter layitzia lekarmelis, then one is permitted to transport, to move the human remains if there is a carmelis. It is preferred, of course, for the people to move. The Yeshayimim, the Shulchan Aruch brings here the other facet of carrying human remains on Shabbos. As I keep on pointing out, there's carrying and then there's muktzah. There are those that say that you should still provide for the muktzah angle by having a kikar, a loaf of bread or something else that is otherwise not muktzah. There are others that say, no, actually, if you're going to put a loaf of bread, which is allowed to be carried to mitigate muktzah, you're essentially increasing in haitzah. And so there's two sides of the coin over here. And there's a day that says that we're not going to encourage mitigating muktzah if it's going to introduce carrying. There is a viewpoint that says that you could even do so in rishus harabim. Anyways, the Shulchan Aruch points out that it's not only issues of decomposition, but other areas of dignity. So this is the Shulchan Aruch. So anyway, suffice it to say, this is an important halacha. This is an important story which brings out this halachic consideration. And again, Be'ezer Hashem, tomorrow we'll start with exploring the Tosfos on yesterday's Gemara. Here we end off on a heavy subject, but also an important consideration in halacha. My dear friends, as we study about painful circumstances, we ask Hashem, we had to be destined to deal with such a circumstance. Let us be yotzei through our Torah study. We should all be blessed with good health, good circumstances, and koyach to continue studying the entire Talmud one page, one line at a time. Thank you for your wherewithal as we get to parts of the Gemara that make us think. But I assure you that if you put up with this, it's going to be worthwhile, because these are important and big principles that will be applicable throughout the discussion on the laws of Shabbos and future scholarship on the subject. Thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful day. And we'll just allow for any final closing remarks, and then we'll invite everyone to leave the link and rejoin to study today's Chumash. Thank you all. Have a good day. See you all tomorrow. All right.
So Rabbi,
Yes.
I had a strange, not the first time, I had a strange thought. I was trying to think at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and we have all the rabbinic takonas, they take time to come about. What happens in the period in between?
It's not a strange question at all. You're asking an interesting question. I'm not going to answer you now. I'm just going to fill it out. There's a question, because you're right. Sometimes the Chacham made a takana, and sometimes it caught on like wildfire. Sometimes it didn't. What happens if it didn't proliferate? Or what if not everyone knew about it? Good question. There's some substantial and solid responses to that question. And Mirz Hashem, we've covered, and I'll if you remind me, we'll have more to share. But I don't want to hog
It's a whole study by itself, I imagine.
Yeah. I'll just tell you this: there's such a principle as a gzera that the people that didn't catch on, and sometimes we had this actually when we talked about the mikvah, if you remember. Sometimes the gzera doesn't catch on, and then sometimes it doesn't end up having the force, the halachic force. Whereas other gzeras which end up becoming part of Jewish practice, they are now irrevocably part of the Jewish tradition. All right, to be continued. But shkayach, I wouldn't call this a strange question at all. It's actually a very good
Like, for instance,
and wise
like an
question.
Eruv.
But now I need to hit end because Rabbi Shalmer needs to teach the next class. Shkoyach.